Well, good morning, Emmanuel Church family. Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Word of the Week. We are sitting here recording, and first of all, let's talk about the weather. It's Wednesday morning, and I woke up expecting it to be mid-April, and it feels like it was mid-February. I'm wearing a jacket, and so welcome to Winterville, quite literally. So it's been an interesting morning so far. But me and Pastor Blake are here to discuss a few things with you guys. We want to say hello again. We're several weeks into this thing now. We're still adjusting to this new mode of existence, and we hope you all are doing well. This past week was Resurrection Sunday, or Easter Sunday, the biggest day of the year for Western Christianity. And I got to say, it was probably the most unique Easter of my adult life. Would you?
And that
agree?
might be the biggest understatement of the whole podcast, right there.
Yeah, it was weird. It was a very strange day, not being able to gather with church family. It was just different. I think all the Christians in the world could probably echo that same sentiment. So it was an interesting week, but in some ways, it was a really good Easter Sunday.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know what you were able to do all day long, but the whole day for me was I did miss the church family, but it gave me a chance to be more contemplative about
Sure.
the resurrection, and so it was very interesting. And so obviously Pastor Blake preached through the resurrection and discussed the topic of the resurrection. Give us those two opening questions you had when you kind of started off the sermon this past Sunday.
Well, the two goals for the message was one for the skeptic, someone who doesn't believe in a literal bodily resurrection, and the second one was for believers. The first one for the skeptic is to compel a skeptic to consider the possibility that the resurrection does not require blind faith.
Yeah.
But rather reasonable faith that can be both intellectually and emotionally healthy for you. The second one for the believer is to instill more confidence in the resurrection, intellectually and emotionally, that will ultimately lead to spiritual stability in their lives.
Yeah, and I think he accomplished that goal pretty well. It was very encouraging. I encourage you that are listening, if you weren't able to catch it, the sermon from this past Sunday is available on our Facebook page. Mm-hmm. You just go and find our most recent video, and you can watch our service from this past Sunday. So we're just going to, for the next few moments, kind of discuss the resurrection in general and its role in the Christian's life. And this is really a relevant topic for anybody, because if you are a Christian and you find yourself bored or maybe not interested in the resurrection, then you might need to reconsider your Christianity and your understanding of it. And interestingly enough, if you are not a Christian, the resurrection is a pretty relevant topic for you. And we're gonna discuss that later in the episode. But first off, why is the resurrection so important for the Christian faith? What makes it such a big deal for the Christian faith? So let's kind of talk about that for a minute. What's your first answers, and then I'll kind of follow up with that.
Without the resurrection, then the crucifixion means nothing.
Yeah.
Reason being is that coming and living
for a Christian,
for a believer, yes, for a believer, it means nothing in regards to if you don't have a risen Christ, then you don't have a Father who has vindicated the sacrificial atonement. That means the sacrifice was not accepted.
Yeah.
And we see that throughout the Scriptures, the promise of the resurrection in Old Testament, and then with Jesus himself, as he prophesied, tear down this temple and it will be rebuilt in 3 days.
Yeah.
And so it was a vindication of Christ, his life, his teachings, his sacrifice. And so without it, then there's a question mark.
Yeah.
There would be a question mark about the Messiah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the royal seal on the life of Jesus and his ministry. It's the anchor of our faith in so many ways because it does verify Jesus' ministry to us from the Father and his claims to that ministry, which is so huge. But it's also our final hope because this is something that's, can be easily disconnected if you're raised in the church. So if you're listening and you've just always been raised in the church, you've probably heard 1,000 times in your lifetime that without the resurrection, it's meaningless. Well, that sounds, great, but it can become cliche.
Absolutely.
And you can miss that doesn't mean that we have to believe in the resurrection, even if it's not true. Like it's a part of our logic, and if we don't have it, our whole story is broken.
Right.
It's more than that. It's we're going to discuss how it is verifiable in history. Okay, it's a historical event, but more so than that, it's connected to our final hope because what I don't feel like was talked about a lot when I was, coming up in church, and I think a lot of Christians in general were coming up in church, is how we're going to be resurrected. Mm-hmm. The connection with the resurrection to human beings, and Paul talks so much about the resurrection.
Oh yeah.
The analogy of a seed, that our bodies are seeds of these celestial plants in a way, and the seed goes into the ground and dies, but something grows from it, and we are going to be resurrected, and so without the resurrection of Christ, the first resurrection. Mm-hmm. He's called the first fruits.
First fruits.
Yeah, and the first of many brethren. And so without Christ's resurrection, there is no second resurrection. There's no us being resurrected. And I don't think Christians spend a lot of time thinking about, I will be resurrected. They think when you die, you go to heaven, and that's it.
And to play onto that point, that the resurrection, our resurrection, is the final act of God righting the stain of sin. Yeah. God through the resurrection,
reversing the fall.
It's reversing the fall. It is now sin does not take anything from the believer. That's why it's not just a soul that is going up into heaven and
floating around
in
an orb.
No, God is righting the wrong that happened to the human body.
Yeah.
For the believer.
And we really got to fix that, and especially in the Southern Church, in our theology.
Right.
Because if you have a messed up view of the next life, it'll mess up your view of this life.
Absolutely.
And if you think the next life is granddaddy and grandmama die, and you float up to heaven around on a cloud and you get your wings, and that's the end of the story. If you look at life that way, then you'll think of that as this vague, fluffy dream, and this is reality.
Right.
So you'll invest in this life, things of this life, and the next life will not be as big of an investment it's just it's the closing credits to your movie. But really the resurrection changes all of that.
Yeah.
The next life is the real life.
That's right.
This is the hazy dream. We will be real bodies that will continue on in existence in a beautiful recreated world that God is preparing for us. Amen. And so the resurrection brings us that good news, and it shows us the first fruits of that good news, that like Jesus walked around, like he ate. One of the coolest passages to me is in is it John, where he makes breakfast for the disciples?
Yes.
Yeah. So at the end of John, one of the first things Jesus does with his disciples afterwards is he cooks some breakfast. And I was just like, I just thought that, and he asked them, y'all have any fish?
Right.
And they're like, no. And he's like, I cast it on the other side. I need some fish. Mm-hmm. And I think they called 153 because it gives the number. Mm-hmm. And he cooked them fish and had a bunch of other stuff and bread and stuff. And so he made breakfast. So you think about a resurrected body having greasy fingers. He sat over a fire and cooked a breakfast meal and ate it with them. So he's not a floating, glowing orb. He's a resurrected, glorified body, as a physical body. Mm-hmm. So when we think about that, God has so much in store for those that love him, and it's just an encouraging thing. So anyway, so the resurrection is, we could go on and on about how important it is for the believer. But
and how necessary it is for the believer.
Oh yeah,
Authentic
to live
belief
the life
in the
of a Christian.
resurrection is a necessity for salvation.
Yes, definitely.
And because really, what do you have hope in? 1 Thessalonians, when we grieve, if there's no resurrection, then we are to grieve as those who have no hope.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's huge for the Christian faith, inseparable. But let's talk about why is the resurrection also relevant in some ways, and to the skeptic or to those that don't believe. Why is it important to the skeptic? What's your first thoughts, and then I'll
Well, I think intellectually, that's what we evaluated first of all. Is the fact is that we see these hypotheses, we see these thoughts or these movements that come along that try to explain away the resurrection, and there's some desperation behind it. Some of them, a lot of times, they just kind of fade with time, like the mythers, that Jesus didn't exist at all, and then even secular people are like, they don't even acknowledge that. The fact, the desperation about Jesus not actually dying on the cross, that is that's been put away as well because of the logical nature of, okay, these are trained torturers in Romans, and for them to not have the wherewithal to know if he is dead or not. And then, of course, we see that even the scriptures account that there was even a conspiracy trying to be conspired by Caiaphas, the high priest, to pay them. And so, and of course, many would say, well, that's one that's favoritism. Of course, that's going to be something like that in the Bible with that. But if we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, of course, the Apostle Paul, I feel like of all of them, the Apostle Paul is probably the greatest historical fact for evidence for the resurrection. So
he's a documented figure.
Yeah, a philosopher that
he had
renowned.
He had a distinct shift,
right.
With no advantage to
Yeah, there was absolutely no advantage for Paul to go from being a high-ranking Pharisee of all Pharisees, Orthodox Jew, to embracing Christianity, where
with political power.
Yeah, who had political power, influence.
Yeah, he wasn't a nobody.
Yeah, it was. There was nothing to gain for him to go and do that, and then the conversions of those who were even after that weren't disciples pre crucifixion, but converted afterwards.
Yeah,
those Orthodox Jews, there's nothing for them to gain by believing in a fairy
even
tale.
Jesus' siblings.
Yeah, James,
who rejected him in his ministry in his death.
Yeah,
but only after something that happened after his death that we call the resurrection. Only after that, these people randomly are all of a sudden diehard Christians.
His brothers and his sisters convert, and the same brothers and sisters that told him, "You're embarrassing us. People think you're crazy. Stop talking this way." But something shifts in them to where now, James is killed, at the hand of Herod, because of his belief in his brother. And it's just an amazing thing, and But Gary Habermas, I know you're going to reference that as far as towards the end, the 12 minimal historical facts.
Yeah.
That's intellectually just a fabulous resource for believers to know and to have confidence in those.
Yeah. That he hit the nail on the head when he said that. So I have an interesting background for those of you that know me personally. In this area, the resurrection's a big deal for my history, my personal history. I was raised in a Christian home, in a Christian environment, a traditional Christian environment, and I kind of rebelled against all that, and over time was attracted to agnosticism, and then eventually atheism, and almost violent atheism. So during my time as an atheist, there are so many things that are easily attacked about the resurrection. But what I found, about Christianity, but what I found hard to attack was the resurrection. All of a sudden, in my mind, I thought, well, that's the most miraculous thing in the Bible, and obviously going to be the most easily dismissible. But then I came into contact with this dude that you mentioned, Gary Habermas, and I would challenge any skeptic that would be listening. I don't know who you are. But if you're doubting the resurrection or struggling with the resurrection, I would challenge you to try and get in contact with Gary Habermas via his website, which he does email people, which is astounding that he has the time for that. Mm-hmm. If not, he'll push you to some different people, like some guys we're going to talk about in a minute. Ron Davis is a close friend of mine. He was huge during my doubt struggling, and he does doubt counseling as well. But I would challenge you to just watch some of his YouTube video debates or something like that, and see if you can. Gary Habermas is a trained, credentialed historian. Okay, right. And so he's going to historically, it is very hard to disprove the resurrection, and some would argue impossible. Using historical methods and means, Gary Habermas developed, and I discovered this as an atheist. He developed this system called the minimal facts of the resurrection. And what he did was he took it was really groundbreaking, but he took all of the body of historians and historical scholarship about that period of time, specifically the resurrection, and he tried to boil down what are the minimal facts, the minimal things that all or majority, a large majority, 75% or higher, usually up into the 90 percentile of historians agree upon about the resurrection. And he compiled that list and then tried to argue from that list that you should believe in the resurrection, that it's a intellectually stable position and verifiable position, and a historical position of integrity. You're not making up fairy tales. You can believe in historical data that indicates that from those minimal facts, the best explanation to explain all of those is that Jesus actually did do what he said he did. He rose. And we can't list all of them, but I encourage you to go to GaryHabermas.com or just Google Gary Habermas minimal facts theory, and it'll give you all of them. But you'll be astounded. I mean, guys, if you're interested, you'll be astounded at what's on that list. Something like one of the best ones is the conversion of Paul.
Right.
We have so many documents in the New Testament and other verifiable sources that make Paul a real historical figure, just as much as Julius Caesar was a historical figure. And Paul, had this random, insane conversion that's just hard to explain from any other way. And there were people that at least believed they saw and experienced a resurrected Christ. Now you can say they hallucinated. Those are some of the opposing theories, but you have to explain. You have to explain something called mass hysteria. Like that all these people could
over
have
500 people.
Yeah, could have and even if the historical data indicates fewer, I mean, how do you explain that 10 or 15 people had the exact same vision and the exact same dream or the exact same hallucination? And there's just when you combine that with all these other facts you can look up online, that all these minimal facts, at the end of the day, you really have to search for and be hungry for so you have to get creative with how it couldn't be the resurrection. And so I really, as an atheist, wanted to fight him through the screen, and argue against this data. I was like, okay, so historically it might seem like he resurrected, but I don't believe that it's scientifically verifiable or whatever. So you can choose to believe what you want, but at the end of the day, what it did was the Christian brain, the Christian side of me, the Christian worldview that was so weak and anemic in my head, it showed me that, wait a second, this isn't a weak, anemic, puny worldview. This has got some girth to it, some heft to it, and it is a falsifiable claim and a verifiable claim that Jesus rose from the dead. So we don't believe that Jesus in some private room resurrected and no one saw him and then he went up in heaven and that was it. No, we have all these other pieces of evidence that point us to this public thing that Jesus Christ did and claimed to do. And it's just huge for the skeptic. So I invite you, if you're a skeptic, I'm not saying this
Absolutely.
will convert you magically, but try to disprove it. I mean, go after it, and don't just argue through a screen. Email some of these guys. So I point you all to GaryHabermas.com. Also, CoreApologetics.com. Our dear friend Ron Davis. So he's all but his dissertation to be a doctor. So Dr. Ron Davis. He does doubt counseling via email. You can go to his website, CORE apologetics.com. And you can sign up for doubt counseling, contact him, read his resources. And there's a bunch of Mike Lacona, different other people you can look up online. I mean, if you want to really engage with this, try and disprove them. Wrestle with the issues, challenge them to a debate over the phone. I invite you to do what you can. Because I was an atheist, I engaged this discussion, and it was an arm of God's grace in my life to draw me back to Him, and to save me, really, because the resurrection is what saves. I mean, Paul came into contact with the resurrected Christ, and what an awesome thing.
Absolutely.
Any final statements from you? Any final admonitions?
Well, now going back to the believer, that about the emotional aspect of this, the comfort that comes with it. Look at the life of Peter. After the resurrection, before the realization of a resurrected Savior, and then the confrontation with the Christ afterwards. I mean, he's broken down. He's beaten himself up. He abandoned Christ when he swore he wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
He felt guilty. And Christ, and the Scriptures are so evident to say, make sure when you tell the disciples that you tell Peter too.
Yeah.
I haven't given up on him. And that's so encouraging. And then Mary Magdalene, who was a reject culturally,
Yeah.
and so forth, and Jesus was all she had, and I mean everybody else is a wreck around her. And Jesus, I mean, talk about there's no gain in the Scriptures by making women the first.
Oh yeah, that was one of the minimal facts.
Because of
the women were
culture,
first.
a misogynistic culture,
Yeah.
And so with that, Mary Magdalene, who felt abandoned and alone, and yet the resurrection changed that. The reality of it, you're not alone. I'm here, Mary.
Yeah.
And that's just powerful for the believer to be able to glean on that today.
Yeah.
In this dark time, and but in a dark day with the weather.
Yeah.
But
we still serve a resurrected Christ.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we hope you've been encouraged this morning. We encourage you to go back and watch the sermon if you haven't, and continue to find hope in the resurrection. Lean into the resurrection today. Let it comfort you and strengthen you as a believer. If you're a skeptic listening and you're struggling, I encourage you to really study the resurrection, to also dig into the resurrection and see what fruit it could bring from your study. So we hope this has been encouraging. We love you. To our church family, we, your pastors, miss you terribly. We can't wait till this all lifts and we can go back to normal life. But until then, we love you, and we can't wait to talk to you again next week.